The shooter has been around for almost as long as video games themselves. Space Invaders and Asteroids made the genre popular. By the early 1980s, scrolling shooters started to appear, with Williams' Defender being the first horizontally scrolling shooter. Vertically scrolling shooters appeared short after that with games such as Xevious. But then 1985 happened, and one of the most popular shmups in the world was released. Gradius.
Shooters, Brasel. Shooters.
What's wrong with shmup?
I'm old school, man. I grew up with shooters in the 80s and 90s, and that's what we called them. Shooters. And that's what I still call them. I'd never even heard the term shmup before until maybe 10 years ago, and I guess I detest the fact that one of my all-time favorite genres, the title had to take a back seat for first-person shooters, which I'm not really a fan of at all. I suppose I am a little bitter about the shooter genre declining in popularity over the years, so there probably is a little bit of animosity there as well.
Well, Wes, thanks for the clarification. Let's take a look at Gradius and its arcade counterpart, Nemesis. Gradius was released in Japan in arcades sometime in 1985. In the game, you pilot the Vic Viper, a one-man starship on a mission to save his planet from an invasion. The game was later ported to the NES, among other systems. Gradius is a horizontal shooter that involves a lot of really tough levels that will challenge the player without remorse. Collecting these power-up icons after destroying a row of like enemies or special orange-colored enemies will advance your power-up bar by 1. There are power-ups for speed, missiles, double shot, lasers, options, and a shield that protects you from damage. On top of the power-up bar, options are a defining characteristic of Gradius. They are orange balls of light that will trail the Vic Viper, firing whenever the player fires. Dying will erase all power-ups and start you from a predetermined checkpoint. In most Gradius games, this one included, that usually spells the end of your run, as trying to advance with no upgrades to your ship equals a very tough time for the player. The boss battles are split up into mini-bosses and a showdown with the boss ship. Shoot the core, as the old saying goes. Gradius is plenty tough, but totally beatable if you really knuckle down in practice. It's an iconic classic and one that any retro gamer worth their salt should play at least once. The NES port of Gradius is actually pretty faithful to the original arcade incarnation. Most levels, enemies, and bosses are present in both versions, but there are some interesting differences. Alright Wes, let's take a look at the differences between Gradius on NES and Nemesis on arcade.
Right on, man. Let's check them out.
The first and most obvious difference between the two games is graphics and sound, with the arcade having the upper hand, which is to be expected. The NES, however, does accurately portray the graphical elements found in the arcade, making a decent-looking early NES title. The music is also ported over well. While the quality of the music may take a bit of a hit, it's still catchy and sounds great.
The arcade version of Gradius in North American and European territories was renamed Nemesis, while retaining the original name when ported to the NES. A separate Game Boy adventure starring the Vic Viper was later released, also titled Nemesis, but is a completely different game altogether.
In Gradius for the NES, if you die, it's mostly over, especially if you restart in the middle of the stage. Having no upgrades makes for a very tough time, especially when you are too slow to maneuver and your standard shot doesn't kill things quickly enough. In Nemesis, however, after you start up after a death, there are plenty of orange enemies on screen that allow you to power up the Vic Viper to a tolerable point, which makes proceeding after a death much easier. The arcade version is actually more forgiving than the NES, surprisingly.
The infamous Konami code originated with the Famicom and NES versions of Gradius. Pausing the game and entering up, down, left, right, BA grants the Vic Viper with a speed boost, missiles, 2 options, and a shield. A continue code was also added, as Gradius forces you to restart from stage 1 once all of your lives have been exhausted. Entering down, up, BA, start at the game over screen allows you to continue from the same stage that the game had ended.
The shields you gain by using your power-ups on the question mark on your power-up bar protect the Vic Viper from damage. In the NES version, the one I was initially most familiar with, Damage from all directions is blocked, even though the shields only appear at the front of the ship. The arcade, however, only blocks incoming fire from the front, meaning the back of the fighter is still exposed. The arcade also makes you wait after initiating the shields. They don't appear directly in front like they do in the NES game, instead appearing off screen and approaching your craft slowly. So be careful when reapplying shields.
The options in Gradius are essential in order to survive the horrors of outer space. Mimicking and trailing behind the Vic Viper, the options provide additional firepower. On the NES version, you're able to collect a maximum of 2 options, while in the arcade version, you can obtain double that. With 4 options trailing behind the Vic Viper, the enemies in the arcade version can be annihilated at a much quicker rate. Safety in numbers definitely applies here.
The laser weapon was shortened on the NES version of Gradius. The penetrating blue weapon of death covers the screen in the arcade, as it does in most later versions of the game. That doesn't make the NES lasers any less useful, however. They still tear through enemies, just in shorter bursts.
The ability to warp ahead and skip stages was added to the NES version, meeting certain criteria to do so. An example of the conditions which need to be met to warp from stage 3 to stage 5 is as follows. At least 10 Moai heads need to be destroyed, then immediately following the destruction of the core boss, the Vic Viper is then thrust into a quick-paced speed warp where blue outline transparent Moai heads must be avoided before slowing down and transitioning to stage 5.
The famous phrase, "shoot the core," originates from Gradius 2, but it still applies to the first game. The Big Core Mark I boss appears in both Gradius and Nemesis, but there are some small differences in its appearance. The NES version has you fight a mini-boss, such as the erupting volcanoes in the first stage, then the Vic Viper moves off the planet to fight Big Core Mark I. The core boss actually appears immediately after the mini-boss fight in Nemesis, without moving the ship to a space field. This is likely due to limitations on the NES and to decrease any slowdown that would occur.
On the arcade version of Stage 4, immediately before encountering the core boss, you must avoid and destroy spinning androids that attack from the right side of the screen, zigzagging towards the Vic Viper. The NES version, on the other hand, is completely different, forcing you to survive a barrage of boulders being spit from 2 inverted volcanoes, similar to the ones encountered on the first stage.
There are 2 stages in Gradius that were meant to scroll vertically as the player neared the top or the bottom of the screen. This isn't present in the NES version. This makes maneuvering around the screen easier in Nemesis, giving you more room to pilot the Vic Viper. However, in Stage 3, you are kind of able to exploit this by flying near the top, mitigating the amount of fire from the Moai heads.
The NES version has a few Easter eggs to discover, such as bonus points gathered by flying through gaps in rock formations or grazing the tips of floating peaks to earn 1-ups. These bonuses are inconspicuously absent from the arcade version.
The end of the game in both versions is arguably pretty anticlimactic. Just shoot the connectors for this brain boss and then an immediate jump to a short end cutscene. While the NES version has a corridor filled with common enemies to dodge, the arcade does something a bit different. There's a floating frame that tries to fry the Vic Viper with electrical beams, followed by 2 tentacle-type guns before the door that leads to the final encounter. I think the arcade version looks and plays great, but my preference is for the NES version. It might be the Konami code, and it might be the 8-bit graphics and sounds. Actually, it's probably the 8-bit graphics and sounds. I love the NES, and in this case, this is the one I rather play. They're both really cool experiences, though, and you should try it out. But it's really impressive that Konami was able to squeeze that big arcade machine into this little NES cart, especially at the time that this was released. And the only real slowdown that occurs on the NES version is in Stage 5, with the blobs with the arms, and the funny thing is that the slowdown occurs in the arcade game as well. What do you think, Wes?
You know, Brasel, as much as I love the NES version, I actually find myself leaning more towards the arcade version here. Without a doubt, the NES's music is fantastic, but I'm a real sucker for arcade sound chips, and I feel that the arcade version has a bit of a more pop to it. Not to mention the graphics on the arcade version are pretty impressive for a 30-plus-year-old machine. And the forgiving nature of the Gradius arcade, in regards to giving you more red orbs to give you a snowball's chance in hell after death, is a huge factor for me, But I think the biggest thing that makes me like this game more is the additional options. Having 4 options on the arcade allows you to eradicate the enemy a lot quicker and allows for much more perilous gameplay. I gotta go with the arcade, man.
Whatever your preference is, 8-bit graphics and sound, or the better looking arcade version with 4 options and more enemies and more forgiving gameplay, you're going to have a good time. Gradius is a really good game. So I want to thank my friend Wes for stopping by and helping me do this palette swap. Thanks, Wes. And that's all I've got. I'll see you guys later.